We're good to
Okay,
go.
so we are recording. Great. So I always say this when I do a talk for Alzheimer's services in the capital area, but I think it bears repeating. This organization does so many great things for patients and caregivers of people who have Alzheimer's disease. And so, as an Alzheimer's researcher, if they asked me to do a talk every week or every month, I would probably say yes with no qualifications because of all the great things that they do for the community. So, let's see. I've talked about drugs for Alzheimer's disease in the past to this group of people. So hopefully you'll get some new information and I'll give an update about what I think are the most important updates over the past year. And so I'll start by just providing a disclosure that I have received grant funding from Eli Lilly to do a study of tirzepatide, what you may have seen in the advertised as Mounjaro, which is a weight loss drug. So I did a study on that weight loss drug and why people lose weight on that drug. Turns out Eli Lilly also does drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So the work I did for them was not related to Alzheimer's disease, but I need to disclose that I have this financial relationship with Eli Lilly that's unrelated to what I'm about to tell you about. And so what I'll do is just start off with what might be the punchline for some of you, which is that over the past 12 months, there's been no new, entirely new drugs that modify the course of Alzheimer's disease that were approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 2025. So this is a little bit different than previous years. In 2024 and 2023, we did have brand new drugs that had not really been on the market before that were approved for Alzheimer's disease. And so I think for some of you who are just want to get the top line answer, if you just wanted to know if there's any new drugs, I get it. And this is the answer. But we did learn quite a bit about either the existing drugs or new drugs that are not yet approved but are on their way into development. So I thought I should lead with that kind of punchline, just so that you don't have to wait if that's what you were the information that you were looking for out of this presentation. So what I'll do over the next maybe half an hour or so, I like to leave time for questions, but this is what I'm hoping to cover. I'll just provide a review about how the approved disease modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease work. And this is going to be more or less a repeat from last year's presentation. Hopefully, it's not too repetitive for those of you who saw that presentation. And then I'll talk about some of the add-on information or some of the new things that we learned about the approved drugs in 2025. And then I'll talk a little bit about what has been in development or what we learned about other promising drugs that are not yet approved in 2025. And finally, it's not exactly about the drugs per se, but it's very important in terms of figuring out who can get drugs for Alzheimer's disease and how easy it is to get those drugs. I will talk about blood tests for Alzheimer's disease as the last topic. So let's start by just reviewing. And again, this is going to be a little bit repetitive if you went to this talk last year, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, how the approved disease modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease work. And what I always do is I try to explain these drugs in terms of a metaphor. And the metaphor involves criminals who engage in criminal activity and law enforcement. So we know, unfortunately, that there do exist criminals that are out there in the world who do damage to our society in various ways, and they operate and they have kind of a damaging effect. We also have law enforcement that are there to neutralize the effects of that criminal element. And so ideally, we have law enforcement that are neutralizing the effects of these of criminals. Unfortunately, not every law enforcement member knows the identities of all of the criminals that are engaging in crime. And in fact, if the police do not have a description of the criminal, they can walk right by criminals that are walking past them on the street and not know that they should be arrested. And so, how do we solve this problem of making sure that law enforcement know who the threatening actors are that engage in crime in our society? Well, we have this is kind of old-fashioned talking about wanted posters. In the Old West, they would have been actual paper wanted posters with a description of the criminal, and it would be posted in various places. Nowadays, we have all points bulletins so that police get a description of the individual that they should be looking out for, but they get this critical piece of information, which is a description of the criminal who is out there in the world. And armed with that information, you can see that law enforcement in this picture has the description of the criminal in their possession. And armed with that information, the police are able to zero in on that individual and arrest them and neutralize them so they no longer have a negative effect on our society. So I use this metaphor because the way you can think of the way that the drugs for Alzheimer's disease that are approved, the way that they work is by supplying the brain's law enforcement with a description of the criminal in the brain so that the brain's law enforcement can neutralize that threat. And in particular, your brain does have a kind of enforcement system that takes care of chemical and other threats. It's called your immune cells. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, there is a molecular criminal called amyloid beta. So, one interesting fact about amyloid beta is that your brain is producing amyloid beta all the time. The reason why it's being produced is a little bit mysterious, but it's being produced over the course of your lifetime at all times. And in Alzheimer's disease, what happens is that you have an over accumulation of this chemical bad actor called amyloid beta. And the accumulation of it makes the individual molecules thread themselves together like a blanket and form these things called amyloid plaques, which are kind of like gooey clumps of this molecule. And that leads to a variety of different ill effects. And the problem, or the reason I should say, why amyloid beta accumulates in the brain in this way is that your brain's law enforcement system, the immune cells, don't know that they should be neutralizing this molecular bad actor. Immune cells are primed to break down molecules and chop them up and metabolize them and make them go away. They do it all the time. They just don't know that they should be targeting this specific one called amyloid beta. So, what the drugs for Alzheimer's disease do is tell the immune cells of the brain that this particular molecule, amyloid beta, is the bad guy that needs to be targeted. It provides a wanted poster or an all points bulletin that says this amyloid beta is the bad guy. And in fact, this is one of the kind of biological tragedies of Alzheimer's disease, if you will, that if you look in the brain of someone who is eventually going to develop Alzheimer's disease 5 or 10 years in the future, you'll see an immune system that is just rip roaring and ready to go. And it is functioning just fine. It just doesn't know that it should be chopping up this amyloid beta stuff. And so, just like we provide law enforcement with all points bulletins or wanted posters in the good old days, we use these drugs for Alzheimer's disease to provide what's called an antibody that signals that the amyloid beta should be targeted by the immune cells. And it's not quite the same. This is where the metaphor kind of breaks down a little bit. It's not the case that the immune cells carry the antibody with it. It's that the antibody binds itself to the amyloid beta molecule as a kind of homing beacon or a signal saying, hey, immune cells, come over here and target me and chop me up. So once the antibody has been delivered to the brain, it latches on to the amyloid beta molecule. And it's at that point that the immune cells know that they should attack that molecule and chop it down and metabolize it and make it go away. So this is how the two FDA approved and ready to be subscribed drugs for ready to be prescribed drugs for Alzheimer's disease work is by priming the immune system to break down the offending molecule in this way. So there are two such drugs that are currently clinically approved. One of them is called lecanemab. That's the generic name. The product name is called Leqembi. That's the what you might see advertisements show as Leqembi. Those are the companies listed there that developed and are marketing the drug. It is provided to you as a once every 2 weeks infusion, although I'll come back to this topic later about how it's administered. So, in order to qualify for being prescribed one of these drugs, an individual must be clinically diagnosed with mild memory problems or dementia. And this is another critical point we'll return to later. The individual must have evidence that there is the accumulation in the brain already of this amyloid beta molecule. And the way that you test for that amyloid beta molecule being built up in the brain is through PET imaging or by having a lumbar puncture, what's commonly referred to as a spinal tap. And what a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture does is it pulls a bit of cerebrospinal fluid or CSF out of your spinal column and does a chemical analysis of it to see how much amyloid is in that fluid. So if you're positive for that PET or CSF lumbar puncture test and you show signs of mild memory problems or dementia, then you will become qualified for to be provided this drug called lecanemab. Now, I mentioned that amyloid beta molecules aggregate together. They form thread-like structures that then form together into sheet-like structures. And it seems, for whatever reason, that this lecanemab seems to attack or does a good job of breaking down amyloid that has sewn itself together into thread-like structures, not so much when it gets to this sheet-like level. And that might be important in terms of the importance of getting the drug prescribed to the individual as early as possible. Because if you get it to the person as early as possible, maybe more of the amyloid in their brain is in this thread form as opposed to fully formed sheets. The second drug that is currently approved is called donanemab. That's the generic name. And the product name that you might see in advertisements is Kisunla, and it's the one that is marketed by Eli Lilly. This one is a monthly infusion. And again, it's the same criteria for being eligible for it. It's only for individuals who have gone through tests at the doctor's office and have been diagnosed by a doctor with mild memory problems or dementia. And again, they need to have proof that there's the buildup of amyloid in the brain using PET or CSF measurements. And hopefully it makes sense that if the drug is there to attack the amyloid in the brain, that in order to qualify for it, you have to have amyloid in the brain. And that's why you need those PET or CSF measurements. And for whatever reason, I don't think scientists really understand why this is, but donanemab seems to attack these fully formed amyloid plaques or sheets or glob-like structures as opposed to the thin fibrils of amyloid that seem to be favored by lecanemab. Now, there's a lot of conversation about the side effects of these drugs because they can be significant. So in the definitive research studies of lecanemab and donanemab, there have been non-trivial rates of what we call, the technical term is ARIA-H, but that's brain bleeding. The H stands for hemorrhage, and ARIA-E, the E standing for edema. And simply put, about 17% of the people who were on lecanemab in the critical clinical trial showed signs of brain bleeding on MRI scans of the brain, and about 13% showed signs of brain swelling. That's what edema is. And you would see these on a conventional brain MRI scan. You can see that for donanemab, the side effect rate was a little bit higher than this, with about 30% of people showing signs of brain bleeding. So it is true that a very small, like a handful of people who are in the definitive clinical trials did have such a serious medical event as a result of this that they passed away during the clinical trial. But that was a very small number of people in a study that might have had 3,000 or 4,000 people in it. And just about everyone else who showed this kind of symptom on brain MRI went back to normal after the drug was discontinued. So while a lot of people get to the side effects and they find that the side effects are relatively common at a rate of 30% in the case of donanemab, and they say, whoa, I'm stopping there. But then some people go further and they say, yeah, there's side effects in a lot of cases, but I'm going to figure out that those side effects are there through regular MRI scans that are put on me for as long as I'm on the treatment. And then if they show up, chances are I can just stop the drug and go back to normal and I'm right back where I started. So that's how some of the people I've talked to as they walk through the decision about whether to go on treatment or not, that's how they kind of have worked through this logic. And so if you were to go on either one of these drugs, regular brain MRIs would be part of that so that they can monitor for this kind of side effect. And then the other side effects that come along with these drugs are the more relatively minor ones. So some people develop flu-like symptoms. It is a regular infusion, which means there's a site where a needle will go into your arm and you can get irritation at that site and other kinds of side effects of an infusion, none of which have been considered especially serious. One of the very first questions that gets asked, and it's actually not a super easy question to answer, is how big of an effect do these drugs have? It's the most obvious thing you might want to ask. And I usually show this figure when I try to answer that question. The first thing we have to do when we evaluate a drug is try to quantify what the drug is doing in some way. It's a difficult thing to do because these drugs affect your overall quality of thinking, your overall quality of thought, and as a result of that, your quality of life. So what we do is we have a rating scale that tries to evaluate in a number how well you are able to perform the normal actions of life. So this can include everything from performing uh, bathing, dressing yourself, putting together a simple meal, remembering the tasks of your day, navigating through a simple route from your house to the bank or the store or some of your usual destinations. And we provide a rating for that, and that's called the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale, sum of boxes. And someone who is completely independent and completely taking care of their own self would score a 0 on this. And someone who has been institutionalized because they really can't take care of themselves and is dependent on 24-hour care would score more like a 1.5 or a 2. So here you've got in blue, you're showing over the course of 18 months, people who were put on placebo, who did not get any kind of drug, but were monitored closely because they were enrolled in this clinical trial. What happened to this score that we give them, summarizing their overall kind of quality of life? And hopefully, I can show my laser pointer and you can see some of these things. But you can see that in the blue line, these people are declining over the course of 18 months. Going down is worse. And you can see that they lose about 1.6 points on this scale over the course of 18 months. The people who were on lecanemab lost less. They only lost about 1.2 points, as you can see there. So another way to think about the benefit of lecanemab in this trial is to look at where people ended up on lecanemab after 18 months and then go back and see how quickly they would have gotten there if they had gotten no drug at all. And you can see that after about 18 months on lecanemab, the average person is about where the placebo person would have been after a year. So this is a little bit like saying lecanemab gives you 6 more months of a certain level of functioning every 18 months. And as I'm pointing out here on the side, the longer term studies have now been done of lecanemab to suggest that that benefit extends out all the way to 3 years. So after about 3 years, you have gained about a year of functioning at a certain level relative to someone who did not take any drugs at all. So that's kind of a review of where we were at the beginning of 2025 with respect to those two clinically approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And I'll say, just anecdotally, people are taking these drugs. Um, I've had a few cases of individuals who have come to me for advice, and I'm not a physician. I make that very clear. I'm a researcher, but we go back and forth about, well, what do you think about this, and what do you think about that? And in the end, a lot of them do end up taking one of these two drugs, and so they're out there. And so I think it's important that we continue learning about these drugs as over time, and that's more or less the main thing that happened in 2025. So, a couple of things that are advances with respect to lecanemab. First of all, I mentioned that it is a once every other week infusion. That's what was clinically approved in the first place. And when I say infusion, that means going to an infusion center, whether it was whether it was a center designed in the first place mainly to cater to dialysis patients or people who are on chemotherapy. It's getting in your car and driving to an infusion center so that they can put the needle in you and kind of evaluate you while you're sitting there receiving the infusion. And that's a nuisance. And I think especially people who are out in the countryside, that's a major commitment in transportation to get to the closest infusion center that can serve them. So in lecanemab's case, there was a great deal of effort put into reducing infusion treatment burden. One of the things that they did was get the FDA to approve a monthly infusion as a what they call a maintenance therapy. So what this means is that they want to make sure that you get your best shot at benefit from the drug over the first 18 months. So for the first 18 months, you're getting a once every other week infusion. But then after that, you can switch to a once every month infusion. So it's getting half of the drug that you had gotten during the first 18 months. And the studies have shown that the people who drop down to once a month, as opposed to once every other week, have similar benefits to the people who just stay on once every other week all the way out to 3 years. So, on one hand, this cuts the number of trips you have to make to an infusion center in half. The other thing it does is it drops the dosage of the drug to the minimum that provides a benefit. So this is one of the general principles of drug prescription. Is that you want to put someone on the lowest dose possible that provides a benefit. If a low dose and a high dose both provide the same benefit, provide them with the low dose because likely it will lead to a lower level of side effects than giving them the high dose. So that was approved. But shortly thereafter, so this happened in at around this time last year, so towards the end of January. But shortly thereafter, a weekly subcutaneous injection of lecanemab, which you can give to your own self, was approved by the FDA also as a maintenance therapy. So I think, if you've been following health and medical news at all over the past couple of years, you've heard of Ozempic or you've heard of Wegovy, these blockbuster weight loss drugs. And one of the things that you know about them is that you administer them to yourself by holding a plunger up to your abdomen and pressing a button, and it injects the stuff straight into your abdominal adipose tissue. This is what the maintenance injection of lecanemab is all about. So it looks to all the world like Ozempic, and it is there to provide you with, again, a maintenance dose so that for the first 18 months, you are doing the standard infusions once every other week. And then from 18 months to 3 years, you are providing yourself with an injection subcutaneously. Again, just like Ozempic, you're sticking a needle into your abdomen once a week after that. So obviously, this is This is getting closer to what people want. So it turns out that for pretty much every medical problem, the thing that pretty much everyone wants is a once daily pill that they can take in the morning. And we're not quite there. But the thing that people really don't want is to have to drive to a medical facility to get their treatment. They want to take them at home. And there's all kinds of real world practical reasons why that's true. So lecanemab, that's still available, but again, that's only at the maintenance time point, if from 18 months onward. And the reason why this was approved is that the studies were done that had half of the people stayed on the once every other week infusion from 18 months to 36 months. The other half of the people were switched onto this injector, and their outcomes looked like they were about the same as each other. So that's what really made it possible to provide these injections as an option for people. And the way that Medicare is handling this is that they're giving you the choice. So they're saying, if you want, if you made friends at the infusion center, for example, you can continue on with the once every other week infusion, or you can switch to this injection that you do yourself at home. So that's one of the major changes that happened with lecanemab. It's the same drug though. So that's why I say no totally new drugs have been approved. This is the same drug. It's just being delivered to you in a different vehicle via an injector as opposed to an infusion. So I mentioned that it's difficult to quantify the benefits that you would get from lecanemab because it's thinking skills, which are complex and are all encompassing. And so we try to talk about this clinical dementia rating scale, which is a number that you try to put on the ability to perform everyday tasks. So a new study came out over the past year in which a group of researchers at Washington University in St. Louis tried to quantify the benefits of lecanemab in a slightly different way. They had 282 people in their center who, at a certain point in time, were eligible to start lecanemab or donanemab. There were three different outcomes associated with that. So some of the people decided not to do the treatments at all for various reasons having to do with the side effects or what have you. There was a group of people that started donanemab at that time point, and there was a group of people that started lecanemab at that time point. And what they did is they followed these people over time and asked the question, how long before those people lost their independence? And what we mean by independence is your ability to take care of your own body, essentially. So for how long were these people able to sustain without needing help with grooming, dressing, preparing food, using the bathroom, and really essential tasks of maintaining your own body in this way? And you can see what the results of this study were, that the people who declined both treatments only went on to be independent for about 29 more months. And those who took donanemab went on to be independent for about 37 more months. And those who took lecanemab went on to remain independent for about 39 more months. So again, the numbers that are kind of swirling around are on the order of half a year to a year when we talk about the effects of donanemab, because you can see that between not getting treated at all and being on donanemab, this person, the average case, gained about 8 more months of independence in this essential taking care of your own body sense. So we are still in this situation in Alzheimer's disease that we have drugs that slow the progression of the disease, that there's not really much evidence that they slow the progression of the disease by decades or by 5 years or by 8 years, but that they slow the progression of the disease by months or maybe by a small number of years. And this study just kind of reinforces this concept with the proviso or the caveat that it was not a huge study. It only had 282 people in it. But again, I think it's always worth thinking about the benefits of these drugs from multiple angles or using different ways to quantify it because again, it's something as holistic and complicated as your independence or your ability to think on your own. So, and yeah, I guess this was the theme for lecanemab in 2025. It was reducing the number of trips to an infusion center while maintaining the benefits of the treatment. Now, with donanemab, so at the beginning of 2025, they had not yet done their 3 year or their 3 year long study had not quite completed yet. It completed in 2025 with very similar messages as for lecanemab. So the what they did is they had an initial clinical trial, and this is the most common thing to do in this type of setting. You randomize 3 or 4,000 people to either being on donanemab or getting placebo. Then after 18 months, you show that the donanemab had a benefit, which I've just described. And at that point, you do what's called an open label extension, which is to say it's probably no longer ethical to keep the placebo people in the dark about the fact that they were getting no drug at all. So you just tell everybody, you say, all right, everybody, um, this is what you got already. And then you give everybody, whether they were initially on placebo or initially on donanemab, you give all of them the option of whether or not they want to continue with the donanemab. And you're going to have some people who were on placebo who said, well, heck, I mean, if it worked that well, get me on there. And then you're going to have people who didn't really decline as much or for various reasons don't want to start the donanemab. And this is what lecanemab was able to show in 2024. Donanemab showed the same thing, which is that the people who were already on donanemab for 18 months and stayed on it for 18 more months had a continuation of their benefits relative to the people that started off on placebo and stayed on placebo. It's like the placebo people kept declining, 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 and the people who were on donanemab kept doing a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better than them. And then the people who switched over from placebo to donanemab in the middle and only had 18 months on the drug, they were in between. So it was a very kind of satisfying picture where it's not the case that you take donanemab for 18 months and then it all of a sudden is no longer effective. It appears to remain effective all the way to out to 3 years. Okay, so this is not necessarily new in the US. There hasn't been much of a change in coverage. Lecanemab and donanemab are now covered broadly by Medicare, and most regulatory agencies in other countries have also provided broad coverage, with some exceptions. So in 2025, the UK decided that they were going to continue to not cover these drugs. And this was the third and final try, or final. It was the third try at getting their National Health Service to cover these drugs. And in the event, they just decided that the the trade-off between risk and benefit was not beneficial enough relative to the high cost of providing these drugs that the National Health Service would have to pay for. And Health Canada went in the other direction where they held off and they held off and they held off. And now Health Canada, they have these provincial health plans up there. And now they are allowing the companies to market to the individual healthcare plans of the individual provinces. But as of now, they're not broadly covered by these provincial health plans. So I think worldwide, we're seeing there's a somewhat of heterogeneity in terms of which countries are covering the drugs and which ones are not. But for the most part, they're getting around this idea that the benefit may be worth the cost in those countries. Okay, so that's what we learned about the already approved drugs. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about what we learned about other promising drugs in 2025. So there And I'll just kind of overall, the broad picture of Alzheimer drug development looks like this. Um, there's it is a fact that the manufacturers of lecanemab and donanemab are making money now because they're selling the drug because there's such a great need. So other business figures did one of two things. They did what good business people do, which is that they see a place where people are making money and they say, well, wow, I want to make some money too. And they did one of two things. They either said, well, these folks are making money by attacking brain amyloid, so let's invest in attacking brain amyloid too. Or they did the other thing, which is they said, these people are making money by attacking brain amyloid. Let's invest in drugs that do something else. So I'll first talk about the drugs that are under development that also try to attack brain amyloid. So one of them is this not very easy to pronounce thing called valotremeprosate. It's what people want. It's a pill. It's twice daily, but never mind that. The idea is not that it provokes the immune system to attack Alzheimer molecules. It's that it forms a coating or a kind of envelope around the individual amyloid molecules so that they don't aggregate in the first place. And a curious biological fact that I don't think anybody knows the reason for is that if those amyloid guys don't aggregate and form clumps, then they don't have ill health effects. And we're not quite sure why that is, but if you can prevent them from clumping together, you can prevent, we think, Alzheimer's disease. And so the company that markets this velotramprosate is banking on that idea that if they prevent the amyloid from aggregating in the first place, they can prevent the disease. So it is going in the prevention direction, not the treatment direction. It's in the prevention direction, which is to say, if you take someone who already has aggregated amyloid in the form of amyloid plaques and you put them on this drug, it might not do very much good because the amyloid that's in plaque form is just going to sit there and cause the ill health effects that it does. And preventing more of those plaques from forming might be too little too late. The very interesting thing about this drug is that it doesn't provoke the immune system to attack amyloid the way the monoclonal antibodies do. And I'm sorry, I didn't define this early on. The drugs that are approved for Alzheimer's disease are called monoclonal antibodies or MABs. That's why their names all end in MAB, is because they're monoclonal antibodies. So not provoking the immune system is considered a favorable approach because the side effects of these and other monoclonal antibodies are usually thought to be due to the immune system getting confused and attacking molecules that are not bad, like amyloid, but other molecules that are just bystanders. So if you're familiar with autoimmune diseases, this is what they are. So multiple sclerosis, for example, is your immune system getting confused and attacking the wrong cells, the cells that are there to do healthy, positive things. And so if we can get by without provoking the immune system, we would. And that's what valotramprosate is trying to do. They finished a medium-sized clinical trial, and it showed positive effects that are similar to those of lecanemab, but only those who we catch very early on in the disease course, only those with very mild memory problems. So this company we think, is raising money now to do the definitive large-scale trial to show how effective this drug is to go for FDA approval. So that, I think, is coming up. So it's attacking amyloid, but in a different way than the approved ones. So there's a drug called gantenerumab that didn't work very well relative to lecanemab and donanemab in breaking down amyloid amongst people who already have kind of this what we call sporadic Alzheimer's disease that develops typically in the 70s and 80s. but it seemed to do quite well in preventing Alzheimer's disease in people who have a rare genetic form of Alzheimer's disease called autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease that always, always, always causes Alzheimer's disease. It puts you on a railroad track to it. And so it's it's crushing this autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease because it is extremely virulent. It the people who develop this disease decline very, very rapidly, often in their 40s or 50s. And again, that's because it's a different type of Alzheimer's disease. It's caused by a genetic mutation. And so anything we can do to try to prevent that or push off the effects until later on in life is highly welcome. And gantenerumab may actually do that. So and so that came out in 2025. And also, the company that built gantenerumab and marketed it in the first place modified it to make it easier to get that stuff into the brain. So, crossing the blood-brain barrier is this complicated and difficult thing that we ask molecules to do. Trontinemab is like gantenerumab, except it gets into the brain better. So I think it makes sense that if you're trying to get 100% of your drug from the bloodstream into the brain, that you would want to get it to pass by the blood-brain barrier and get more of it in there. And that's what trontinemab is doing. It's currently under development in medium-sized trials. So this is a diagram that shows you all of the different possible not all, many of the different possible drug targets for Alzheimer's disease. And the red circle is showing you that the approved drugs and what I've told you already about what's in development have really only been attacking one of these 8 different areas, and that's called the amyloid hypothesis. So now and like I said, some drug companies are drilling down further into amyloid as a possible therapeutic area. Other companies are going after some of these other possible biological pathways to come up with complementary treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Now, yeah, this is one of the biggest news stories of 2025 in terms of Alzheimer drugs, is that Novo Nordisk, the makers of Ozempic, generic name semaglutide, they put on 2 very large clinical trials to see if Ozempic can slow the course of Alzheimer's disease, and they failed. So on one hand, semaglutide did improve Alzheimer biomarkers. So these are the PET imaging, the CSF measurements that I talked about, and also blood measures of amyloid and other proteins in the brain, but it did not show a benefit for cognitive decline. And this news just came out in late November. So as of this moment, Novo Nordisk is still figuring out what it wants to do next. And while I don't know, I would have to assume that Eli Lilly, which makes a very similar drug to Ozempic or semaglutide, which is called tirzepatide, is waiting in the wings trying to cogitate on what exactly they're going to do. They're either going to abandon Alzheimer's disease altogether and stick to obesity, where they're making ungodly sums of money, or they're going to try to target a different part of the population in terms of slowing Alzheimer's disease for them. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, I talked a lot about how amyloid is this molecule that builds up and aggregates in the brain. There's another one called tau. It's a protein that aggregates and builds up on the inside of your neurons. And at the same time as there's been a huge amount of effort on anti-amyloid drugs, there are now a few anti-tau drugs that are making their way through clinical trials. Unfortunately, the most promising of them, called posdenimab, again, it's a mAb. So if you're watching closely, you know that ends in MAB. It's a monoclonal antibody that does the prime the immune system thing. It alerts the immune system to the fact that it should be attacking this tau protein. And unfortunately, it did not work very well in a medium-sized clinical trial. Johnson & Johnson, I think, is figuring out what it's going to do now, because it had to halt that trial due to a lack of benefit due to that drug. And I'm sorry that you can't tell that those in this line, it's BIIB080. That's a different type of drug that tries to reduce this production of the tau protein by messing with gene expression. It received an FDA fast track approval status, which means that it should have a shorter time to approval if it turns out to work. It's currently in a medium sized trial. So it took a long time for drug companies to decide that they were going to go all in on tau therapeutics, but now those drugs are starting to work their way through, although no breakthroughs yet. Okay, so that's an overview of what we learned about other promising drugs outside of the approved ones. So I'll just end with what I think is an important topic, which is blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. So in May, the FDA approved a blood test for Alzheimer's disease called the Lumipulse G blood test. It's produced by a Japanese company called Fuji Rebio Diagnostics, and it has been approved for diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. Now, it's been approved based on research studies that it did showing that 92% of the people who came back with a positive blood test actually did have brain amyloid, and 97% of the people with a negative blood test actually didn't have brain amyloid. So you can see it's not 100% in either direction, but it's pretty good, especially when the prospect here is that you're going to use this blood test, which we get all the time, instead of a PET scan that gives you radiation or a lumbar puncture that's sticking a needle into your spinal column. So what does this mean? So this means that the company is now allowed to market the test, assess real world performance in real actual healthcare plans, and eventually market or push and advocate for Medicare coverage. It's not covered by Medicare yet. This is the part where we now try to see how this blood test, which has only been used really in a university research study setting, what actually happens when it goes out into the real world. So, and like I said, if Fuji Rebio is successful in its mission, it could be the next step towards removing the need for those lumbar punctures or those PET scans. And I mentioned the countryside, I don't know, the Felicianas and, out in Bunkie and Washington Parish. I mean, I don't even know where you go to get a PET scan out in these places. Or, I mean, maybe your local medical place can do a lumbar puncture, but maybe not. Everybody everywhere can get a blood test. And so this could be a major breakthrough in terms of who can eventually get the drugs that I've been talking about. So just to summarize, because I did want to leave time for questions, the two approved disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease appear to continue to be effective for as long as 3 years. That's what's really been studied very rigorously. I used to say 18 months. Now we can fairly confidently say 3 years. Insurers are covering these drugs for most patients that qualify. And one thing that happened is that the need for frequent trips to infusion centers is starting to go down, which I think is a positive thing. Other drugs that work differently are coming along, but we haven't had that breakthrough earthquake moment yet. And just generally, drug companies are investing heavily in this space. If you just count how many clinical trials are going on, that has gone up over time because they're like sharks that smell blood in the water. They see Eli Lilly making a bunch of money. They see Biogen making a bunch of money. And these drug companies say, I want in on that action, which is, I think, in the long term, going to be a good thing for patients. And finally, blood tests are on the way that could make it no longer required that you get a lumbar puncture or a PET scan in order to qualify for these drugs. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for paying attention and open it up for questions for as long as we've got.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carmichael. Always so informative and so helpful. And you have such a talent for taking something that's very big, very daunting, and can be really difficult to understand and explain in a way that's really easy to understand. So thank you so, so much. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Carmichael, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I did see one question pop up though that says, Aren't there people who have been shown post-mortem to have amyloid plaque buildup and not have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease?
Right. So we in the research or in the Alzheimer's world really did ourselves no favors by using the same term, Alzheimer's disease, to refer to clinical signs and symptoms, what the doctor observes in the doctor's office on one hand. We call that Alzheimer's disease. And the proteins that I talked about, we also call that Alzheimer's disease. And that's caused a huge amount of confusion. So we define Alzheimer's disease by the presence of amyloid and tau in the brain at autopsy. So if that brain meets those criteria, the brain has Alzheimer's disease, period. If we can tell from, and it so happens that the typical individual who has those two proteins in the brain show a typical set of clinical signs and symptoms, but not always. So there are some people that have those two proteins in the brain, but for whatever reason show more of a movement disorder, Parkinson's kind of feature to the doctor. And so they don't look like they have Alzheimer's disease, but in the end, they have Alzheimer's disease. So there's really two different things that you have to define. What is the protein that's present in the brain and what the clinical signs and symptoms are. And again, whoever asked the question is correct that those two often, most of the time, line up real well, but sometimes don't.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next question says, where can we find out about all drugs currently being used in treatment pre-2025?
So the Alzheimer's Association is a national organization that provides advocacy, especially on Capitol Hill, for funding and all sorts of different services for the entire nation. And when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, and they have informational pages that I think do a pretty good job of walking people through the different drugs and the different benefits. And it also goes into topics that I didn't get into. So there are drugs that are specifically approved for dealing with the symptoms that you show that are more behavioral. So for anxiety and depression amongst people who have Alzheimer's disease, they have, I think, great information that walk you through all the ins and outs.
And I was going to ask too, and I guess to go along with that question, what is a source that you would recommend to people to kind of keep up with new information on drugs? Because there's a lot and it's hard to know what's a trusted area. So what would you say?
You know, this is maybe not super popular opinion, but I am very, very skeptical of science journalism. So if there's a headline, even reputable sources like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or you pick your favorite mainstream media source, they are in the business of selling clicks more so than providing accurate information. So I tend to wait. And if there's a big breakthrough like the Fuji-Rebio test, there will be a press release put out by the Alzheimer's Association. And so I generally will go to an advocacy source like that. There are a couple of other ones worldwide, like AIM is another one. It's Alzheimer's
Impact
something
movement.
impact. Thank you.
Mhm.
Go to them and look for their very kind of patient oriented, because their whole reason for existing is that they're advocating for patients and families. And so I tend to go there and really hold the mainstream media at an arm's length.
Thank you. Our next question says, how do you determine the measure of risk for brain bleed before participating in the injection of the drugs?
Right. So and this is also something that a clinician can lay out for you. There's really a couple of different factors that are involved. So one of them is a genotype. So there's a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease called ApoE. People who have a certain genotype for ApoE have higher risk than if they don't. And also, some people are on blood thinners, anticoagulants. those people have elevated risk. And in fact, I think if you're on a blood thinner, you do not get put on these drugs at all. And there are a couple of other factors having to that are from your medical record, and that's where I think it's this is what doctors are good at a lot of things, but this is what one of the things that doctors are extremely good at is looking at in depth your own medical record and your own medical history and putting all that information together in an understandable way. So I would say talk to your doctor.
All right, we have one more question in the chat that says, any evidence on NAD and AD?
So I think it's probably about NAD plus, which is what I would call an energetic molecule. And what NAD plus does is it really helps your cells to produce the energy that you need to perform various actions. Um, I wouldn't say that there's strong evidence specifically about NAD plus supplementation and Alzheimer's disease, but I would say that the underlying theory is one of the 8 different spokes that I showed in my diagram, which is what we call the energetics hypothesis, that your brain cells lose their ability to produce and use energy, just kind of like your car engine not being able to use gasoline the way it used to, and that there's a sequence of events that leads from there to Alzheimer's disease. So NAD plus is not dead in the water, but there's not strong evidence yet.
Thank you so much. And I'm saving the chat for you because there's so many nice comments in the chat from everybody. But thank you so, so much for your time, Dr. Carmichael. Always so valuable and appreciated. And thank you to everyone that joined us today. We are right at the 1 o'clock hour. So thank y'all so much. Hope everybody has a good rest of your day.